Quote, he wrote an imperious letter to the Asiatic prelates commanding them to imitate the example of the Western Christians with respect to the time of celebrating the festival of Easter, that is, commanding them to celebrate it on Sunday. The Asiatics answered this lordly requisition with great spirit and resolution, that they would by no means depart in this manner from the custom handed down to them by their ancestors. Upon this the thunder of excommunication began to roar. Victor, exasperated by this resolute answer of the Asiatic bishops, broke communion with them, pronounced them unworthy of the name of his brethren, and excluded them from all fellowship with the Church of Rome. End quote. Mushheim, Chapter 4, Paragraph 11. The one means by which these church managers secured from Constantine the use of the power of the state was the famous edict prohibiting certain kinds of work on the venerable day of the sun. That edict runs thus, quote, let all the judges and townspeople in the occupation of all trades rest on the venerable day of the sun, but let those who are situated in the country, freely and at full liberty attend to the business of agriculture, because it often happens that no other day is so fit for sowing corn and planting vines, lest the critical moment being let slip, men should lose the commodities granted by heaven. End quote. This edict was issued March 7, A.D. 321. Only judges and townspeople and mechanics were to rest on Sunday. People in the country were at full liberty to work. But this did not satisfy the political managers of the churches for any great length of time. The object of the first Sunday law, says Sozomen, was that the day might be devoted with less interruption to the purposes of devotion. And as the government was now a theocracy, it was only consistent that all should be required to be religious. Consequently, an additional Sunday law was secured, which commanded all people to do no work on Sunday. Quote, by a law of the year 386, those older changes effected by the Emperor Constantine were more rigorously enforced, and in general, civil transactions of every kind on Sunday were strictly forbidden. Whoever transgressed was to be considered in fact as guilty of sacrilege. End quote. Neander, page 300. Then, as the people were not allowed to do any manner of work, they would play, and as the natural consequence, the circuses and the theaters throughout the empire were crowded every Sunday. But the object of the law, from the first one that was issued, was that the day might be used for the purposes of devotion, and that the people might go to church. Consequently, that this object might be met, there was another step to take, and it was taken. At a church convention held at Carthage in 401, the bishops passed a resolution to send up a petition to the emperor, praying, quote, that the public shows might be transferred from the Christian Sunday, and from feast days, to some other days of the week. End quote. Item. History does not say whether or not this petition represented the names of 14 million petitioners, the greater part of whom never signed it at all. History is also silent as to whether the petition was endorsed by any one man who could be counted for 7,200,000 men. But, history is not silent as to the reason why it was necessary to send up the petition. The petitioners themselves gave the reason, and it was this, quote, the people congregate more to the circus than to the church. End quote. Idem, Note 5. In the circuses and the theaters large numbers of men were employed, among whom many were church members. But rather than to give up their jobs, they would work on Sunday. The bishops complained that these were compelled to work, they pronounced it persecution, and asked for a law to protect those persons from such persecution. The church had become filled with a mass of people, unconverted, who cared vastly more for worldly interests and pleasures than they did for religion. And as the government was now a government of God, it was considered proper that the civil power should be used to cause all to show respect for God, whether or not they belonged to a church, or whether they had any respect for God. The people, not being allowed to work, crowded the circus and the theater. They had no wish to be devoted, and as they were forced to be idle, a flood of dissipation was the inevitable consequence. Neander says of it, quote, owing to the prevailing passion at that time, especially in the large cities, to run after the various public shows, it so happened that when these spectacles fell on the same days which had been consecrated by the church to some religious festival, They proved a great hindrance to the devotion of Christians, though chiefly, it must be allowed, to those whose Christianity was the least an affair of the life and of the heart." End quote. Item. And further, quote, "Church teachers were in truth often forced to complain that in such competitions the theater was vastly more frequented than the church." End quote. Item. And the church could not then stand competition. She wanted a monopoly. She got it, at last. Quote, "This petition of the Carthage Convention could not be granted at once, but in the year 425, the desired law was secured, and to this also there was attached the reason that was given for the first Sunday law that ever was made, namely, in order that the devotion of the faithful might be free from all disturbance." End quote. Idem, page 301. It must constantly be borne in mind, however, that the only way in which the devotion of the faithful was disturbed by these things was that when the circus or the theater was open at the same time that the church was open, the faithful would go to the circus or the theater instead of to church, and therefore their devotion was disturbed. And of course the only way in which the devotion of such faithful ones could be freed from all disturbance was to close the circuses and the theaters at church time. Thus, and by this means, every reason for not being devoted was taken away from all the people. Then in the very next sentence Neander says, quote, "In this way the church received help from the state for the furtherance of her ends." End quote. This statement is correct. Constantine did many things to favor the bishops. He gave them money and political preference. He made their decisions in disputed cases as final as the decision of Jesus Christ. But in nothing that he did for them did he give them power over those who did not belong to the church, to compel them to act as though they did, except in that one thing of the Sunday law. Their decisions, which he decreed to be final, were binding only on those who voluntarily chose the tribunal, and affected none others. Before this time, if any who had repaired to the tribunal of the bishops were dissatisfied with the decision, they could appeal to the civil magistrate. This edict cut off that source of appeal, yet affected none but those who voluntarily chose the arbitration of the bishops. But, in the Sunday law, power was given to the church to compel those who did not belong to the church, and who were not subject to the jurisdiction of the church, to obey the commands of the church. In the Sunday law, there was given to the church control of the civil power, that by it she could compel those who did not belong to the church to act as if they did. The history of Constantine's time may be searched through and through, and it will be found that in nothing did he give to the church any such power, except in this one thing, the Sunday law. Neander's statement is literally correct, that it was, quote, "In this way the church received help from the state for the furtherance of her ends." End quote. The work, however, was not done yet. True, the bishops had secured the power of the state to take away from the people all excuse for not being religious. But from the beginning of the whole scheme, the people had no real wish to be religious. They had none of the spirit of devotion in their hearts. And although the state had forbidden them to work, and had shut the Sunday circuses and theaters, still the people would not be religious. The next step to be taken, therefore, in the logic of the situation, was to compel them. And the theocratical bishops were equal to the occasion. They were ready with a theory that exactly met the demands of the case. And the great Catholic Church Father and Catholic Saint, Augustine, was the father of this Catholic saintly theory. He wrote, quote, "It is indeed better that men should be brought to serve God by instruction than by fear of punishment, or by pain. But because the former means are better, the latter must not therefore be neglected. Many must often be brought back to their Lord, like wicked servants, by the rod of temporal suffering, before they attain to the highest grade of religious development." End quote. Schaff's Church History, Volume 2, Section 27. Of this theory Neander remarks, quote, "It was by Augustine then, that a theory was proposed and founded, which contained the germ of that whole system of spiritual despotism, of intolerance and persecution, which ended in the tribunals of the Inquisition." End quote. Church History, page 217.